I was standing at Terminal 4 holding a welcome sign for my parents when my blood ran entirely cold. 50 feet away stood my husband, who was supposed to be pitching his startup in Chicago. Instead, he was wrapping his arm tightly around a younger woman and pressing a kiss to her temple. I dropped the sign and stepped forward to scream, but my dad gripped my shoulder with terrifying strength. "Sweetheart, let us teach him a lesson he will never forget," he whispered. "We do not make scenes. We make them pay." I am Maya, 33 years old, and a senior wealth management advisor. I spend my days calculating risks, analyzing portfolios, and protecting assets for high net worth clients. I am trained to spot a bad investment from a mile away. Yet the absolute worst investment of my life was standing right in front of me at baggage claim number 7. My parents, Thomas and Valerie, had just flown in from Atlanta. I had driven to the airport straight from my office, still wearing my tailored navy suit. I was so excited to see them. We had been planning this weekend visit for months. Julian, my husband of 5 years, was supposedly devastated that his big investor pitch in Chicago happened to fall on the exact same weekend my parents were visiting. Hai had kissed me goodbye yesterday morning, putting on a masterful performance of the stressed but dedicated entrepreneur. I had packed his bags. I had even transferred an extra $5,000 into his business checking account to cover the client dinners he claimed he needed to host. Now I watched him pull a sleek Louis Vuitton suitcase off the carousel. It was not his suitcase. It belonged to the woman clinging to his side. Vanessa. I did not know her name yet, but I knew her type. She looked to be in her mid-20s, wearing designer athleisure and a fresh blowout. She giggled as Julian whispered something in her ear. My breath caught in my throat. The physical impact of betrayal is not a metaphor. It is a violent physiological reaction. My chest tightened so severely I thought my ribs might crack. My vision tunneled until the rest of the crowded airport faded into a blur of gray noise. All I could see was the man I loved, the man I had financially supported for half a decade, holding another woman exactly the way he held me. I did not narrate my anger. I felt it as I watched the details unfold. Julian raised his left wrist to check the time. The fluorescent airport lights caught the gleam of the Rolex Daytona resting against his skin. That was the $12,000 watch I purchased for his 30th birthday. He had cried when I gave it to him, telling me no one had ever believed in him the way I did. He said that watch would be a symbol of the empire we were building together. He signaled for a baggage porter. The porter loaded Vanessa's designer bags onto a cart. Julian reached into his wallet and pulled out a card to tip the man. It was not his debit card. It was the platinum credit card linked directly to my primary earnings account. The account I used to fund our mortgage, his car payments, and his endless stream of tech startup expenses. He was using my hard-earned money to tip the porter handling his mistress's luggage. A hot, blinding rage surged through my veins. I dropped the cardboard welcome sign I had spent the morning decorating. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp smack. I took a step forward, ready to tear across that 50-foot divide. I was ready to scream, to throw his infidelity in his face, to cause a scene so massive airport security would have to intervene. Before my foot could hit the ground for a second step, a large, calloused hand clamped down on my shoulder. It was my dad. Thomas is a man of few words, but immense presence. He built a successful contracting business from the ground up in Atlanta, and he taught me everything I know about strategy and patience. His grip was a grounding force, heavy with silent, protective rage. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path to Julian. "Sweetheart," he whispered, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying calm. "Let us teach him a lesson he will never forget. We do not make scenes. We make them pay." I looked up at my dad. His jaw was clenched tight, but his eyes were entirely focused. He pulled me gently but firmly behind a large concrete pillar, completely out of Julian's line of sight. My mom, Valerie, stepped up beside us. She did not gasp. She did not cry. My mother is a retired high school principal who spent 30 years managing chaotic situations with lethal precision. "Wipe your face, Maya," she commanded softly, slipping her arm through mine. "You are a wealth manager. You do not react to a market crash by screaming on the trading floor. You gather your data and you execute a strategy." I swallowed hard, forcing the air back into my lungs. The tears that had threatened to fall evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I nodded. We stayed behind the pillar watching Julian and Vanessa move toward the exit. They walked with the relaxed entitlement of people who believe they are entirely untouchable. We maintained our distance, trailing them through the automatic doors and out into the humid evening air. They bypassed the regular taxi line and headed straight for the VIP curbside pickup. A black luxury town car pulled up. The driver stepped out to open the door for Vanessa. My mom pulled her phone from her purse. With the smooth efficiency of a seasoned investigator, she zoomed in. I watched her screen as she snapped a dozen high-resolution photos. Click. Julian opening the door. Click. Vanessa kissing his cheek. Click. The license plate of the black car. Click. The livery company logo on the side of the vehicle. We have what we need here, my mom said, slipping the phone back into her bag. Now we follow the investment. We rushed to my car parked in the short-term lot. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, but my dad placed his hand over mine. Breathe, Maya, he instructed. Just drive. Do not lose that black car. I pulled out of the parking structure and merged onto the highway, keeping two cars between us and Julian's hired ride. The drive was an agonizing exercise in restraint. Every time I saw the taillights of that black car, my mind raced through the financial timeline of my marriage. 5 years. 5 years of paying the rent on his office space downtown. 5 years of covering the health insurance. 5 years of listening to his grand pitches about how his software app was going to revolutionize the market. I had carried the entire financial weight of our lives so he could have the freedom to innovate. I was not innovating. He was investing my money into another woman. The black car took the downtown exit. We followed it through the bustling city streets until it pulled into the circular valet driveway of the Grand Monarch Hotel. It was one of the most exclusive ultra-luxury hotels in the city, a place where standard rooms cost $800 a night. I pulled my car to the curb a block away, idling in the shadows. We watched the valet open the doors. Julian and Vanessa stepped out. A bellhop rushed forward to manage their luggage. Julian handed the valet a piece of paper, likely a prepaid reservation confirmation. They walked through the gilded revolving doors, completely absorbed in each other. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned ashy. I wanted to march into that lobby and freeze every credit card to his name right at the reception desk. My mom leaned forward from the back seat. Not yet, she said, reading my mind. You do not cut off the supply line until you have secured the vault. Drive us to your house, Maya. We have work to do. The ride back to my house was quiet, but charged with an intense tactical energy. The shock was wearing off, leaving behind a highly focused determination. When we pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it had when I left 2 hours ago. The manicured lawn, the welcoming porch lights, the life I had meticulously funded and maintained. It all felt like a stage set now. We walked inside. I dropped my keys on the console table and finally let out a shaky breath, the silence of the empty house pressed against my ears. I walked into the kitchen and leaned against the marble island, staring blankly at the custom espresso machine Julian had begged for last Christmas. My dad took off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. He pulled out a notepad from his travel bag and laid it on the kitchen counter. My mom opened the wine fridge, selected a bottle of Pinot Noir, and poured 3 generous glasses. She handed one to me. Drink this, she instructed. Then we make the plan. I took a sip, letting the wine burn down my throat. I cannot believe he is doing this, I whispered, the reality finally cracking my professional facade. He looked me right in the eye yesterday and told me he was going to miss me so much this weekend. He asked me to transfer that extra $5,000 for Chicago client dinners. He is paying for that luxury suite with my money. And that is exactly why you cannot let him know you caught him, my dad said, leaning against the counter. If you blow up tonight, he panics. He starts hiding money. He calls his lawyers. He spins a story to his family and makes you look like the crazy, jealous wife. You lose the element of surprise. My dad tapped his pen against the notepad. You are the financial expert, Maya. If a corporate partner is embezzling funds, you do not confront them in the hallway. You audit them quietly. You freeze their assets legally. And then you present the findings to the board. I looked at my dad, my mind shifting gears. He was right. Julian thought I was the clueless, supportive wife. He relied on my blind trust. He relied on the fact that I was too busy working 60-hour weeks at the firm to micromanage his daily spending. My mom took a sip of her wine and set the glass down with a definitive clink. She looked me dead in the eye, setting the ironclad rule for the coming weeks. "Wipe your tears, baby," she said, her voice completely devoid of pity and full of fierce maternal authority. "Tomorrow evening, Julian is going to walk through that front door. He is going to drop his bags and complain about how exhausting his business trip was. And you are going to smile. You are going to kiss his cheek. And you are going to ask him exactly how the wind in Chicago was." I stared at her, feeling the weight of what she was asking me to do. It would be psychological torture. I would have to look at the man who was betraying me sleep in the same bed with him and pretend everything was perfectly fine while the image of him kissing Vanessa burned behind my eyes. "Can I do that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Can I look at him and not completely lose my mind?" "You can," my dad said firmly. "Because you are not just a wife anymore, Maya. You are an auditor gathering evidence. Every lie he tells you from this point forward is just more ammunition for the arsenal." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The image of the Rolex, the platinum card, the luxury hotel all flashed through my mind. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent reviewing client portfolios, making sure their futures were secure, while my own husband was liquidating my life. I opened my eyes and looked at my parents. The tears were gone. The panic was gone. "Okay," I said, setting my wine glass down next to the notepad. "I play the fool. I ask him about Chicago. What happens next?" "Next," my dad said, picking up his pen, "we pull the financial threads. We find out exactly how deep this betrayal goes. Because a man who is comfortable spending his wife's money on a mistress in broad daylight is a man who has been getting away with it for a long time." We spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen island mapping out the initial strategy. I listed every joint account, every credit card, every line of credit attached to my name that Julian had access to. I explained how his startup was structured as an LLC that I had heavily invested in. My parents asked precise analytical questions, helping me identify the vulnerabilities in my own financial setup. By the time we finally went to sleep, I had a comprehensive checklist. I needed to run a full audit on the joint accounts. I needed to discreetly check his business spending. And I needed to contact my dad's friend, a ruthless corporate attorney who specialized in high-asset divorces. I lay in my bed that night staring at the ceiling. The space next to me was empty. Julian was a few miles away in a luxury hotel suite, sleeping next to a woman whose luggage I had paid the tip for. The betrayal was a physical ache in my chest, but the plan we had formed was a shield. Julian thought he was the smart entrepreneur, running a brilliant scheme behind the back of his hardworking wife. He thought his secrets were safe. He had no idea that he had just forced a senior wealth manager to audit her own marriage. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, staring into the darkness of the bedroom. The tears were completely gone now. Tomorrow the performance would begin. I would smile. I would ask about Chicago. And then I would systematically dismantle every single aspect of his life. The game had changed, and I was going to make sure he lost everything. The next evening arrived with agonizing slowness. I spent the day finalizing the preliminary steps of our plan, while my parents ran errands to stay out of the house. I wanted to face Julian alone for this first test. I needed to prove to myself that I could hold the mask in place without breaking. At 6:30, the front door unlocked. I was standing in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. The sound of his rolling suitcase echoing in the foyer sent a jolt of adrenaline straight into my heart. I forced my shoulders to relax. I pasted a bright, welcoming smile onto my face and wiped my hands on a towel. "Maya, I am home," his voice called out, sounding perfectly casual, perfectly normal. I walked into the hallway. Julian looked exactly as he always did, handsome, charming, wearing a tailored blazer and a relaxed smile. He dropped his bags and opened his arms. I walked right into them. He hugged me tight, and the faint smell of unfamiliar floral perfume hit my senses immediately. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to shove him backward down the porch steps. Instead, I wrapped my arms around his waist and squeezed. "I missed you," I said, matching his casual tone flawlessly. "How was the trip?" He pulled back, kissing my forehead with practiced affection. Brutal, he sighed, rolling his shoulders to mimic exhaustion. The investors were tough and the schedule was packed. I barely had time to sleep. I kept the smile locked on my face. "That sounds exhausting," I said, leading him toward the kitchen. "Did you at least get to enjoy the city? How was the wind in Chicago?" Julian did not miss a beat. Freezing as always, he chuckled, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge, but the pitch went well. "I really think this might be the breakthrough we have been waiting for, Maya. All your patience, all your support, it is going to pay off soon, I promise." I looked him dead in the eye, holding his gaze without flinching. I poured him a glass of water and slid it across the marble island. "I know it will, Julian," I said, my voice smooth and steady. "I know exactly what kind of payoff is coming." I pulled away from the embrace and turned back to the kitchen counter, picking up my knife to finish dicing the vegetables. Julian settled onto the bar stool across from me, sighing heavily as he loosened his silk tie. He launched into a meticulously crafted story about his time in Chicago. He told me about the biting wind coming off Lake Michigan, making him shiver as he walked between investor meetings. He described a deep dish pizza he claimed to have eaten alone in his hotel room while reviewing financial projections. Every word out of his mouth was a calculated performance designed to keep me feeling secure and oblivious. I poured him a glass of the expensive red wine he liked and listened with the attentive devotion of a supportive wife. I asked him questions about the investors, prompting him to invent entire personalities and business negotiations right there at my kitchen island. He complained about a particularly stubborn venture capitalist who wanted too much equity in his startup. I nodded sympathetically, offering words of encouragement, while my mind replayed the image of him kissing Vanessa at the baggage carousel. It took a supreme act of dissociation to stand there and smile. I focused on the mechanical motion of preparing dinner, chopping the bell peppers, stirring the sauce, keeping my hands busy so they would not shake. Julian drank his wine and watched me with an expression of complete contentment. He had no idea he was sitting across from his own personal auditor. He told me he was exhausted from the travel and needed to take a shower before we ate. When he walked upstairs, I let out a long breath, leaning my weight against the cool marble counter. The scent of that unfamiliar floral perfume still lingered in the air. I took my phone out and sent a single text message to my dad confirming that phase 1 was complete. I was holding the line. The next morning I woke up before dawn. Julian was still asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful against the white pillows. I dressed quickly in a sharp tailored suit, armored myself with my usual professional demeanor, and drove to my wealth management firm downtown. The city was just waking up, but my mind was already running at full speed. I walked into my corner office, closed the heavy glass door, and sat down at my desk, turning on all 3 of my monitors. I was not looking at client portfolios today. I was diving into my own life. I logged into our joint financial accounts. On the surface, everything looked normal. The mortgage was paid, the utility bills were current, and the balance seemed relatively stable. But I do not look at surface numbers. I look at the routing history, the hidden transfers, the microtransactions that build a larger pattern over time. I started pulling bank statements from the past 2 years, tracking every dollar Julian had spent from our shared resources. It did not take long for the pattern to emerge. Mixed in with legitimate business expenses for his tech startup were regular, consistent wire transfers to a secondary corporate account. The transfers were labeled as consulting fees and software development costs. To a casual observer, they would look like standard operational expenses for a growing technology company. But I traced the routing numbers to an LLC registered in Delaware. I used my industry access to pull the public filing records for that specific company. The managing director of the LLC was listed under the name Vanessa, the same Vanessa from the airport. My stomach plummeted as the full scope of his betrayal crystallized on my screen. This was not just a physical affair. This was systematic financial abuse. Julian was not just sleeping with another woman. He was using the money I earned from 60-hour work weeks to fund a hidden life with her. He was siphoning our joint assets, funneling them into an offshore structure disguised as business expenses. I was building a nest egg, preparing to drain our accounts completely before blindsiding me with divorce papers. He was trying to take my money to fund his fresh start. I sat in the quiet of my office, staring at the glowing monitors. The anger I felt at the airport was nothing compared to the cold, calculating fury that washed over me now. He thought I was just a walking checkbook. He thought my love made me stupid. But he made a fatal error. He tried to embezzle money from a woman whose entire career is built on tracking assets and destroying bad investments. I picked up my phone and dialed the number my dad had given me the night before. The lawyer's name was Harrison. He was a ruthless corporate attorney who specialized in high net worth asset protection and complex financial divorces. I told his assistant it was a priority referral from my father, and within 20 minutes, Harrison and I were sitting in a secure conference room down the street from my firm. Harrison was a sharp, pragmatic man who did not waste time on emotional platitudes. I laid out the financial documents I had printed, the wire transfers, the LLC registration, and the photographs my mom had taken at the hotel. I explained exactly what Julian was doing and how he was structuring the embezzlement through his startup. Harrison reviewed the paperwork, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Your husband is arrogant," he said flatly. "This is a classic asset hiding scheme, but he executed it sloppily because he assumed you would never look." "What is your objective, Maya?" "I want to build an invisible firewall." I told him, my voice steady and resolute. "I want to legally isolate every dollar I earn from this moment forward. I want to lock down my personal investment portfolios so he cannot touch them. And I want to leave just enough in the joint accounts to keep him from realizing the trap has been set until I am ready to spring it." We spent the next 3 hours structuring the defense. Using my professional credentials and Harrison's legal maneuvering, we established a blind trust. I routed my primary income streams and my annual bonus directly into the trust, completely bypassing the joint accounts Julian had access to. We changed the beneficiary designations on my retirement accounts and life insurance policies, removing Julian's name entirely. I legally separated my wealth from his liabilities, ensuring that when his tech startup inevitably collapsed under the weight of his fraud, it would not drag my credit score down with it. I left the joint checking account active, but I transferred the bulk of the savings out, leaving a balance that looked normal for daily expenses, but absolutely insufficient for funding luxury hotel stays or lavish gifts for a mistress. I was cutting off his supply line without making a single sound. For the next few days, I played my role at home to absolute perfection. I cooked dinner. I asked Julian about his day. I listened to his endless pitches about venture capitalists and market scaling. He was so confident, so entirely oblivious to the fact that the financial ground beneath him had completely vanished. He kept swiping the platinum card for expensive lunches and claiming he was working late at the office. I knew he was with Vanessa. I just smiled and told him not to work too hard. The first trap sprang on a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in a client meeting reviewing a quarterly earnings report when my personal cell phone began vibrating frantically on the table. It was Julian calling back to back. I excused myself from the meeting and stepped into the quiet hallway, pressing the phone to my ear. "Maya, you need to call the bank immediately," Julian said, his voice tight with panic and barely suppressed rage. My card just declined. It declined twice in front of the cashier. "This is humiliating." I leaned against the glass wall of my office, building a slow, satisfied smile spreading across my face. "Where are you, Julian?" I asked, injecting the perfect amount of wifely concern into my voice. "Did you try running it again? It must be a system error." "I am at a client lunch," he lied smoothly, though I could hear the faint background noise of upscale retail music. "Not a restaurant. I am trying to pay the bill, and the platinum card is saying insufficient funds. That is impossible. We just got paid." "Fix it right now, Maya. I look like an idiot." I did not need a private investigator to know he was lying about a client lunch. The transaction alert on my phone showed the merchant category and the name of the high-end jewelry boutique where he had just tried to use the card. I knew exactly what kind of purchase he was attempting. The platinum card declined because I had lowered the daily spending limit and swept the excess cash into the protected account structure that morning. I saved the alert and the timestamp with the rest of my records. "Oh no, that is so strange," I said, keeping my tone completely innocent and flustered. The bank has been doing security updates all week. They must have flagged the transaction as suspicious activity. You know how strict they are with fraud prevention. I am so sorry, Julian. Let me call them right now and sort this out. Do you have your personal debit card to cover the lunch? He cursed under his breath, muttering something about incompetent banks. I will handle it here, he snapped. Just get the account unlocked by tonight. I have another meeting later. I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the city below, feeling a surge of absolute triumph. The illusion of his unlimited wealth was breaking. He was standing in a luxury store, unable to buy his mistress a gift because his wife had turned off the tap. It was a small victory, but it was only the beginning. I walked back toward my client meeting, but before I could open the door, my phone chimed with a text message. I glanced at the screen. It was from Claire. Claire is Julian's sister-in-law, married to his older brother Andre. She is a white woman who prides herself on being the perfect supportive wife, while constantly making subtle, passive-aggressive comments about my career. She frequently insinuated that my long hours at the wealth management firm were unnatural and that I was neglecting Julian's emotional needs. I had always tolerated her for the sake of family harmony, brushing off her microaggressions to keep the peace. The text message read, "Hey Maya. Andre and I are hosting a family dinner this Saturday to celebrate Julian's successful Chicago trip. We want to hear all about his big investor meetings. Let me know if you can pull yourself away from the office long enough to join us." I stared at the message, feeling a new wave of disgust. She was deliberately highlighting the Chicago trip, the trip where he was supposedly working hard, but was actually parading Vanessa around the city. The sheer audacity of her invitation felt like a taunt. I took a deep breath, typing my response. I would not miss it for the world, Claire. Looking forward to celebrating Julian together. I slipped the phone into my pocket and walked back into my meeting. The board was set. Julian was panicking about his funds. Claire was throwing a dinner party to celebrate a lie. They thought they were the ones controlling the narrative. They had no idea they were walking directly into a meticulously engineered financial slaughterhouse. And I was going to serve them their ruin on a silver platter. Saturday evening arrived with a thick, oppressive humidity that mirrored the burden resting on my shoulders. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my emerald green dress. I looked calm, powerful, and unbothered by the storm brewing beneath my surface. Julian was pacing around the bedroom floor, frustrated about his banking issues. I had given him a fabricated story about a massive fraud alert that required in-person verification, effectively keeping his spending frozen for the entire weekend. He adjusted his silk tie, looking at me in the mirror, and complained that the situation was getting absolutely ridiculous. He mentioned he had to use his personal emergency card to buy gas today because his primary accounts were locked. I turned to him with a flawless expression of supportive empathy, telling him I knew exactly how frustrating it was to deal with corporate banking errors. I reminded him the bank was just trying to protect our hard-earned assets from unauthorized users. He grunted in annoyance, grabbing his keys from the dresser, and told me we should just leave now. He said Andre wanted to show off his new wine collection, and Claire was probably already complaining that we were late. We drove to Andre and Claire's house in the upscale suburbs in tense silence. Their home was a sprawling modern farmhouse funded entirely by the logistics company Andre ran. What neither Andre nor Claire ever publicly acknowledged was that their entire business operation survived on a massive commercial line of credit from my firm. It was a crucial line of credit that I had personally vouched for and expedited 2 years ago when they were facing bankruptcy. I held the keys to their financial stability firmly in my hands, but they acted as if their wealth was purely the result of their own brilliance. When we walked through the custom double front doors, Claire greeted us with her signature performative enthusiasm. Claire is a white woman who prides herself on being the perfect supportive wife, while constantly making subtle racial and gender microaggressions disguised as sweet Southern charm. She hugged Julian tightly, kissing his cheek and gushing loudly about how handsome he looked and how hard he had been working. When she turned to me, her hug was noticeably brief and stiff, accompanied by a tight, pitying smile that did not reach her eyes. She looked me up and down and told me I looked absolutely exhausted. She chimed that those long hours at the wealth management firm were really taking a visible toll on my appearance. She told me I needed to make sure I was resting properly so I could adequately take care of Julian. She said he had been under extreme pressure with his startup company, and he needed a soft, quiet place to land at home. Her words were intentionally designed to make me feel profoundly inadequate as a wife. She loved to play the traditional nurturing role, while subtly implying that my financial independence and ambition were somehow unnatural or emasculating to her brother-in-law. I smiled warmly, completely ignoring the blatant insult wrapped in her concern. I told her I was doing wonderfully, and that hard work always reveals its true value eventually. I watched Julian soak up her praise, completely oblivious to the quiet venom she was directing at me. He simply agreed with her, saying that he was incredibly lucky I worked so hard so he could focus his energy on building his technology empire. We moved into the formal dining room, where the long table was set with expensive imported china and heavy crystal glasses. Andre poured large glasses of a rare vintage red wine and launched directly into a long-winded boasting speech about his recent luxury golf trip to southern Florida. Andre was just like Julian but older and significantly louder. I thoroughly enjoyed pretending he was a brilliant self-made millionaire, completely ignoring the glaring fact that my corporate endorsement was the single only thing keeping his supply chain business afloat right now. The tension in the room was thick and suffocating, masking itself under the thin guise of family bonding and cheerful celebration. I sat quietly in my chair, sipping my ice water and analytically observing the strange dynamics at play. Claire hovered constantly around the men, serving hot appetizers and ensuring their wine glasses were never empty for more than a minute. She delighted in performing the traditional role of the devoted homemaker, creating a stark, intentional contrast to my own career-driven modern life. She would occasionally glance at me with a look of smug superiority, as if she had unlocked the magical secret to a happy, successful marriage, while I was failing miserably at keeping my husband satisfied. I kept my face perfectly neutral, offering polite nods and agreeable murmurs whenever the dinner conversation required my direct participation. I was not there to socialize with them. I was there on a strict reconnaissance mission, gathering valuable data and analyzing the behavior of the arrogant people who thought they were playing me for an absolute fool. During the main course, the underlying subtext of the evening grew even heavier and more obvious. Claire steered the conversation deliberately toward the city of Chicago, asking Julian incredibly specific, detailed questions about his supposed business trip. She asked him about the exact restaurants he visited and the luxury hotels he stayed in, leaning forward over her plate with an exaggerated expression of intense interest. Julian played along, seamlessly describing a fictional upscale steakhouse he claimed to have eaten at with some wealthy venture capitalists. He talked about the biting cold wind coming off the lake and how exhausting his investor pitch had been for him. Claire laughed, a bright and piercing sound that echoed loudly off the high ceilings of her dining room. She raised her expensive wineglass, pointing it directly at Julian across the long table. She proposed a very pointed toast to successful trips and to finding exactly what you are looking for in the Windy City. Her eyes flashed with a secret malicious amusement that made my stomach churn violently. It was a pointed, cruel inside joke, a shared open acknowledgement of his infidelity happening right in front of my face. Julian smirked, picking up his own crystal glass and taking a slow, deliberate sip of his red wine. The sheer audacity of their coordinated public performance was absolutely staggering to witness. They were actively celebrating his ongoing affair, communicating in a coded language they assumed I was far too stupid and oblivious to understand. I waited for the perfect moment when Andre started telling another long-winded story about his golf handicap. I placed my linen napkin on the table and politely excused myself, claiming I needed to use the restroom. Julian did not even look up from his wine glass, simply nodding, as Claire leaned in to pour him another generous glass of red wine. I pushed my chair back and walked out of the formal dining room. The heavy oak doors muffled the sounds of their laughter as I stepped into the long hallway leading to the guest bathroom. The hallway was lined with expensive artwork and framed photographs of Andre and Claire, projecting the ultimate image of a successful, happy marriage. I walked slowly, my heels making no sound on the thick plush runner rug. As I approached the end of the hall, I passed by Claire S. home office. The door was pushed open just a few inches. The room was dark except for the bright glowing screen of an iPad resting on the center of her pristine white desk. I would normally never invade someone else's private space. I respect boundaries and I expect others to do the same. But the survival instincts that had kept me sharp and successful in the cutthroat world of wealth management were screaming at me to push that door open. The iPad chimed a sharp, crisp sound that cut through the quiet house. A notification banner flashed across the screen, illuminating the dark room for a brief second. I stepped into the office, pushing the door softly behind me. I walked over to the desk, my heart beating in slow, measured thuds. The iPad was completely unlocked because Claire was too arrogant and comfortable in her own home to bother with a passcode. The screen was open to an active messaging application. I looked down and saw a group chat. The title of the chat was Chi-Town Crew. My eyes scanned the screen, tracking the participant list at the top. There were 3 members in this group chat: Claire, Julian, and a contact saved simply as Vanessa. My stomach dropped so fast and so hard that I actually had to grip the edge of Claire's desk to keep my knees from buckling beneath me. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. This was not just a cheating husband hiding his dirty secrets from his family. This was an active, coordinated conspiracy. I scrolled up to the top of the visible messages, my fingers trembling slightly before my training kicked in, and my hands became perfectly still. I started reading the exchange that took place just 2 hours ago, right before Julian and I arrived at their house for dinner. Vanessa sent a message saying she missed him already and wished she was at dinner tonight instead of his boring wife. Julian replied, telling her she was gorgeous and that he just had to play the game a little longer until the offshore account was fully funded. But it was Claire's messages that made my blood turn to absolute ice. Claire replied to Julian, telling him to please stop complaining because he knew I was completely clueless. She typed out the words, "She is a walking ATM for you guys. Just keep her working those late nights." She then offered them the use of her and Andre's private vacation house on the lake for next weekend, telling Julian she would cover for him with Andre if he needed a getaway. I kept scrolling further back into the chat history, uncovering months of vile betrayal. Claire did not just know about the affair, she actively facilitated it. There were messages from 6 months ago where Claire talked about introducing Julian to Vanessa at a charity gala I was too busy working to attend. She encouraged the connection. She fostered the betrayal. She helped them coordinate lies and cover stories. She participated in mocking my career, my dedication, and my love for my husband. She sat at family holidays, smiling in my face, eating the food I brought, accepting the expensive gifts I bought for her, while actively helping my husband replace me. I pulled my cell phone out from my clutch. My hands were perfectly steady now, driven by pure, unadulterated survival instinct. I opened the camera application and made sure the flash was turned off. I took clear, bright photographs of the entire chat history, making sure the contact names, the dates, and the timestamps were perfectly legible. I captured the message where she offered the lake house. I captured Julian discussing the offshore funds he was stealing from me. I captured Vanessa insulting my appearance and my ambition. I took dozens of pictures, ensuring I had a complete and undeniable record of their conspiracy. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my bag. I stepped out of the office, pulling the door back to the exact angle it was before I entered. I walked into the guest bathroom and turned on the faucet, running freezing cold water over my wrists to ground myself. I looked at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. The woman looking back at me was no longer just a betrayed wife trying to protect her assets. She was a woman surrounded by enemies who thought they had successfully outsmarted her. I dried my hands on a monogrammed towel. Destroying Julian was no longer the only objective on my board. Claire and Andre were going to burn right alongside him. They invited the devil into their home, and they were going to suffer the absolute maximum penalty for their complicity. I walked back to the dining table, my blood running like ice water through my veins. The heavy oak doors of the dining room muffled the sounds of their laughter, but I could still hear the arrogant tone of Andre's voice echoing off the high ceilings. I stepped into the room, and the ambient light from the crystal chandelier felt harsh against my skin. I moved with slow, deliberate precision, ensuring my posture communicated nothing but relaxed confidence. I took my seat next to Julian, smoothing the linen napkin over my lap. He did not even look up from his phone screen where he was undoubtedly sending another message to Vanessa. He simply reached out and rested his hand on my knee, a gesture of ownership and performative affection that made my stomach churn with physical revulsion. Claire stood up to clear the salad plates and moved toward the kitchen to retrieve the main course. She returned moments later carrying a silver tray and wearing that self-satisfied domestic grace she loved to weaponize against me. As she set a plate down in front of me, she leaned in close. She smelled like expensive perfume and deep deceit. She picked up a bottle of chilled white wine and poured a generous amount into my crystal glass. She handed it to me with a condescending, pitying smile that she had clearly perfected over years of practice. "You work so hard, Maya," she said, her tone dripping with fake concern and a sickeningly sweet southern cadence. "Make sure Julian is getting taken care of at home, or he might have to find his joy elsewhere. We all know how demanding men can be when they are building their empires, and we wives have to make sure we are doing our part to keep them completely satisfied." I did not snap. I did not throw the chilled wine in her smug face. I did not flip the heavy wooden dining table or scream about the group chat messages I had just photographed in her private office. I let a warm, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile I reserved for corporate rivals right before I dismantled their financial portfolios. I lifted my crystal glass, holding it steady in the air, and clinked it gently against hers. The sound rang out clear and sharp in the dining room. "You are so right, Claire," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated. "We all get exactly what we invest our time into. I am making sure everyone in this family gets exactly what they deserve very soon." Julian chuckled, taking a sip of his bourbon, completely oblivious to the lethal threat sitting right next to him. He patted my hand again, telling Claire that he was a very lucky man. The sheer audacity of his performance was breathtaking. He sat there eating the food his brother's wife prepared, while actively planning to steal my life savings with her enthusiastic encouragement. I took a sip of my wine, the taste of impending absolute justice, sweeter than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. The trap was fully set, and I was entirely ready to pull the lever. None of them would survive the financial reckoning that was coming. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of fake smiles and polite conversation. I nodded along as Julian told Andre more fabricated details about his fictional investor meetings in Chicago. I ate Claire's roasted chicken and complimented her seasoning, knowing it was the last meal I would ever share with these horrible people. I played the role of the tired but supportive corporate wife with an exceptional level of dedication. I watched them exchange their secret glances and hidden smirks, knowing that every single one of their arrogant little jokes was just adding another solid nail to their collective coffin. I watched Andre pour another round of vintage red wine, a bottle I had personally gifted them last Christmas. The irony was suffocating. I had spent years trying to build a bridge between our different backgrounds, overlooking their subtle jabs, because I believed in the sanctity of family. I believed that when you marry someone, you embrace their people as your own. I had used my influence and my hard-earned corporate standing to elevate them when they were drowning in debt. And this was my repayment, a coordinated effort to bleed me dry while laughing behind my back. I took a slow bite of the roasted vegetables, forcing myself to swallow past the lump of sheer disgust in my throat. I looked at Julian, whose face was flushed with alcohol and arrogant pride. He looked so comfortable in his deception, so convinced of his own superior intellect. He had no idea that every single smile he gave me across this table was just providing me with more fuel for the devastating fire I was about to ignite. Andre boasted about his logistics company, bragging about a new fleet of delivery trucks he had just ordered. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who firmly believed his success was a product of his own genius. He completely ignored the glaring fact that his entire business operation survived on a massive commercial line of credit from my wealth management firm. It was a crucial line of credit that I had personally vouched for and expedited 2 years ago when they were facing absolute bankruptcy. I held the keys to their financial stability firmly in my hands, but they acted as if their wealth was purely their own. Sitting there listening to Andre brag and watching Claire play the devoted hostess, I realized the full scope of their betrayal. This was not just a cheating husband hiding his dirty secrets from his family. This was an active, coordinated family conspiracy. Claire did not just know about the affair, she facilitated it. She introduced them. She provided the location for their secret meetings. She helped Julian coordinate lies and cover stories. She participated in mocking my career, my dedication, and my love for my husband. She sat at family holidays, smiling in my face, eating the food I brought, accepting the expensive gifts I bought for her, while actively helping my husband replace me. Destroying Julian was no longer enough. The entire family needed to be eradicated from my life, but not before they were punished for their complicity. Claire and Andre were going to burn right alongside Julian. They had invited the devil into their home, and they were going to suffer the absolute maximum penalty for their betrayal. When we finally left their house hours later, Julian kissed Claire on the cheek and thanked her for the wonderful evening. Claire hugged me again, giving my arm a patronizing squeeze. "Drive safe, Maya," she chimed, her eyes wide and innocent. "Get some rest, you look like you are about to collapse." I promised her I would rest very well. We got into my car, and I drove us back to our house in the dark. Julian leaned his seat back and closed his eyes, complaining about a slight headache from the red wine. I kept my eyes focused on the road, the streetlights reflecting off the windshield as my mind organized the tactical strike I was going to launch on Monday morning. As we drove through the quiet suburban streets, the rhythmic passing of the streetlights cast long shadows across Julian's sleeping face. I looked over at him, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel. 5 years of marriage dissolved into absolute nothingness in the span of a single evening. The man sitting in the passenger seat was a complete stranger to me now, a parasitic entity who had attached himself to my ambition and my success. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent at my desk, analyzing market trends, building wealth portfolios, and securing financial futures for my clients. I was exceptionally good at protecting investments from volatile elements. Julian and his family had just become the most volatile, toxic elements in my life, and I was going to neutralize them with extreme prejudice. The silence in the car was heavy, but my thoughts were racing with cold mathematical precision. I thought about the power I wielded in my professional life. I was a senior wealth management advisor. I had the authority to recall the line of credit keeping Andre's company afloat. I had the power to flag their business accounts for a comprehensive risk audit based on suspicious financial movements. If I submitted a formal report noting a conflict of interest due to irregular wire transfers between Julian's startup and offshore accounts, the compliance board at my firm would immediately freeze all connected assets, pending a federal review. Andre's logistics company would not be able to make payroll by the end of next week. Claire would not be able to pay the mortgage on her perfect suburban home. They would lose the luxury cars, the vacation house on the lake, and the pristine social image they valued above all else. They were relying entirely on my professional reputation to keep their expensive lifestyle afloat, and I was going to pull the rug right out from under their feet. I pulled into our driveway and parked the car in the garage. Julian yawned and headed straight upstairs to bed, leaving me to lock the doors and turn off the lights. I stood in the dark foyer of the home I had paid for, listening to his footsteps on the hardwood stairs. The shift inside my mind was absolute and permanent. I was no longer a betrayed wife drowning in heartbreak. I was an apex predator in a financial ecosystem that I controlled completely. They thought I was just a walking automated teller machine. They thought they could extract my wealth and mock my dedication while maintaining their pristine family image. They forgot that I was the one who built the vault, and I was the only one who knew how to lock them inside it while it burned. The morning after the dinner party, I woke up with a clarity that felt entirely lethal. I looked at Julian sleeping beside me and felt absolutely nothing. The anger had burned off overnight, leaving behind a cold, metallic resolve. Over the next 3 weeks, I operated in pure, unadulterated stealth mode. I was no longer just a betrayed wife navigating a failing marriage. I was a covert operative dismantling a hostile takeover from the inside out. I knew I needed airtight, indisputable proof of everything. I needed visual confirmation to pair with the financial documents I had already secured. My dad made a few discreet calls to his contacts, and by Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting in a dimly lit booth at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Sitting across from me was an independent private investigator named Desmond. Desmond was an older African American man who used to work in high-level corporate security. He did not ask prying emotional questions. He simply took the folder I slid across the table, looked at the printed photo of Vanessa from the airport, and nodded his head. I told him I needed high-definition photographs of them together. I told him I needed dates, times, locations, and a complete pattern of their movements. I gave him the address to Claire and Andrea's vacation house on the lake, and told him to pay special attention to it this coming weekend. Desmond gave me a brief, reassuring smile and told me he would deliver exactly what I needed. Living a double life requires a level of psychological endurance I did not know I possessed. Every single day was an emotional compartmentalization. I maintained the perfect illusion of the loving, oblivious wife at home. I would leave my wealth management firm after a long day of preparing financial executions, walk through my front door, and completely transform. I cooked Julian his favorite meals. I poured him his bourbon. I sat at the kitchen island and listened to his endless, arrogant pitches about how his technology startup was right on the verge of securing major venture capital funding. He would stand there in the kitchen gesturing wildly and talking about equity distribution and market scaling while wearing clothes I paid for. I would nod encouragingly, offering him supportive smiles and telling him how incredibly proud I was of his vision. He soaked up my praise like a sponge, completely blind to the reality that I was mentally cataloging every lie that fell from his lips. I watched him text on his phone, pretending he was responding to urgent emails from his developers. I knew he was texting Vanessa. I knew Claire was probably in a group chat with them right at that exact moment, laughing about how naive I was. The level of restraint it took to not smash his phone against the marble countertop was agonizing, but the promise of absolute justice kept my hands perfectly still. Desmond was worth every single penny I paid him. The man was a complete ghost. Over the course of those 3 weeks, he began delivering regular updates to a secure encrypted email address I had set up exclusively for this purpose. The first delivery came on a Monday morning while I was reviewing a client portfolio. I opened the file and stared at a series of crystal-clear, high-definition photographs. It was Julian and Vanessa sitting at a secluded table in a high-end brunch spot downtown. The camera had captured everything perfectly. I could see the way he looked at her, the way he reached across the table to hold her hand. I saw them walking back to his car, wrapped in each other's arms, laughing carelessly. A few days later, Desmond delivered the most damning set of photographs yet. It was the weekend Claire had offered them her vacation house on the lake. Desmond had captured Julian and Vanessa pulling into the private driveway of the lake house, unloading groceries and wine. He captured them sitting on the back deck watching the sunset together. The images were crisp, undeniable, and utterly devastating to any fake narrative Julian might try to spin. He could not claim she was just a colleague. He could not claim it was a misunderstanding. Desmond had captured the undeniable reality of their illicit life. I spent my lunch breaks locked inside my office, meeting virtually with my legal team and compiling my arsenal. My dad would call me every evening right as I left the office. He would ask me for status updates, treating the entire situation like a tactical military campaign. He and my mom had returned to Atlanta, but they were actively engaged in every step of the preparation. My mom would remind me to keep my voice light and my face relaxed when I walked through the door. She reminded me that the greatest power a woman can possess is the ability to remain entirely unreadable to the people trying to destroy her. I took her advice to heart. During my lunch breaks, I would sit on encrypted video calls with Harrison, my corporate lawyer. We reviewed the evidence Desmond was delivering. Harrison was incredibly impressed by the clean, undeniable paper trail I had constructed. We mapped out the exact sequence of legal events that would follow the final confrontation. The divorce papers were drafted, the asset protection measures were finalized, and the formal notifications to the financial regulatory boards were queued up and ready to be filed. I created a master physical binder. I did not want to rely on digital files that could mysteriously disappear or be corrupted. I wanted physical, tangible evidence that I could drop on a table with a resounding thud. I printed the high-definition photos Desmond had gathered, placing them in clear plastic sleeves. I printed the meticulous wire transfer traces I had run, identifying exactly how Julian was funneling my earnings into the offshore account registered under Vanessa's maiden name. I highlighted the dates and amounts, drawing a direct, undeniable line from my grueling 60-hour work weeks to his luxury hotel stays. Then I moved on to the most satisfying part of the binder. I printed the high-quality photographs I had taken of Claire's tablet screen. The entire chat history of the group they called the Cheetown Crew was laid out in full color. Every cruel joke, every coordinated lie, every time Claire mocked my dedication and called me a walking automated teller machine was printed out on heavy premium paper. I read through her messages over and over, letting her condescending words fuel my determination. She thought she was so incredibly smart, helping my husband cheat on me while smiling in my face at family dinners. She was about to learn that playing games with a senior wealth manager comes with a catastrophic penalty fee. As the end of the 3 weeks approached, the pressure inside our house was reaching a boiling point. Julian was growing increasingly agitated about his banking issues. The invisible firewall I had built around my finances was holding strong, and the joint account was hovering right above zero. He was forced to decline lunch invitations from his so-called investors because his cards kept getting denied. He would come home pacing the floor and complaining bitterly about banking algorithms and temporary holds on his accounts. I played my role beautifully, offering empty sympathy and assuring him that the bank was doing everything they could to clear the fraud alerts. I watched the stress lines deepen on his face. I watched him try to maintain his charming facade while quietly panicking about how he was going to fund his hidden life with Vanessa. He had no idea that the bank was not the problem. His wife was the problem. He thought he was navigating a temporary financial glitch, but he was actually bleeding out from a fatal wound he could not even see. I sat on the living room sofa reading a book and occasionally looking up to offer him a sweet, encouraging smile. He would force a smile back, completely unaware that I was counting down the days until his entire reality collapsed. Every time he lied to me, I just thought about the thick, heavy binder locked securely inside my desk drawer at the office. The waiting was difficult, but the anticipation of the drop was intoxicating. I was gathering all the oxygen in the room, preparing to strike a match, and watch them all suffocate in the flames of their own arrogance. I stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, watching Julian sleep soundly in the bed we shared. The morning sun was just beginning to filter through the expensive linen curtains, casting long shadows across the room. He looked so peaceful, completely unaware that the countdown to his absolute ruin had already begun. I turned around and walked downstairs to the kitchen. I moved with a calm and deliberate energy, preparing a perfect Sunday breakfast. I brewed his favorite dark roast coffee and plated fresh fruit. When Julian finally came downstairs, rubbing his eyes and yawning, I greeted him with a bright and loving smile. He kissed my cheek and thanked me for the coffee, completely oblivious to the fact that I had spent the entire night drafting the corporate documents that would bankrupt his brother and destroy his family. I sat across from him at the kitchen island, listening to him complain about how tired he was from the dinner party the night before. I agreed with him smoothly, telling him he worked so hard and deserved a quiet day of rest. I played the role of the devoted and oblivious wife flawlessly, while my mind counted down the hours until Monday morning. When Monday morning finally arrived, I drove into the city before the sun had even fully risen. The streets were quiet and empty, but the energy pulsing through my veins was electric. I parked in my reserved spot beneath the glass tower of my wealth management firm and took the elevator up to my corner office. The sleek corporate environment always gave me a profound sense of control, but today it felt like stepping onto a battlefield where I held every single advantage. I locked my heavy glass door, turned on my monitors, and logged into the highly secure executive compliance portal. My hands were perfectly steady as I pulled up the commercial lending file for Andre's logistics company. Andre ran a mid-sized supply chain operation that required massive amounts of liquid capital to function on a daily basis. He needed continuous cash flow to cover fleet maintenance, fuel costs, warehouse leases, and employee payroll. 2 years ago, he had made a series of incredibly arrogant and foolish investments that nearly tanked the entire operation. It was my professional reputation and my direct endorsement that pushed his emergency line of credit through the strict underwriting department at my firm. I had personally vouched for his business, ensuring they received a massive influx of capital to keep their doors open. Claire managed the financial books for that company, strutting around her luxury modern farmhouse and acting as if their wealth was the result of their own brilliant business acumen. They both conveniently forgot that I was the invisible pillar holding up their entire lavish lifestyle. I opened the compliance reporting tab and began to dismantle that pillar. I formally withdrew my professional endorsement for their commercial line of credit. I attached the comprehensive risk assessment report I had drafted over the weekend. I documented a severe and immediate conflict of interest regarding highly irregular financial movements linked to Julian S. accounts. I provided the detailed wire transfer traces that showed Julian funneling money from our joint accounts into the offshore limited liability company managed by Vanessa. I deliberately highlighted the fact that Julian and Andre shared business associations and noted a high probability of cross-contamination between the offshore fraudulent accounts and Andre's corporate operating funds. In the strict, highly regulated world of corporate wealth management, the mere suggestion of offshore money laundering connected to an active credit line is an absolute death sentence. I hovered my mouse over the final submission button. I thought about Claire handing me a glass of wine and mocking my dedication to my marriage. I thought about the text messages where she called me a walking automated teller machine. I thought about Andre laughing and boasting at the head of his dining table while helping his brother betray me. I clicked the button and submitted the report. The digital confirmation flashed across my screen, locking the files into the permanent federal compliance system. It was done. There was no reversing it. The automated systems at my firm would immediately flag the account and freeze their operating capital pending a full federal financial audit. The domino had been tipped, and I sat back in my leather chair to watch it fall silently and destructively. The corporate reaction was instantaneous. By Tuesday morning, the automated banking alerts would have fired off to every vendor and payroll system connected to Andre's logistics company. I was sitting at my kitchen counter drinking tea and reviewing a client portfolio on my tablet. Julian was pouring himself a cup of coffee, complaining about his own locked bank cards, and muttering about how the fraud department was taking too long to verify his identity. Suddenly, his cell phone rang loudly on the marble island. He glanced at the screen and answered it, putting it on speakerphone as he reached for the milk. The sound of Andre's voice booming through the speaker was pure, unadulterated panic. Andre was shouting, breathing heavily, and asking Julian if he knew anyone at the corporate banking level. Andre said every single one of his corporate accounts had been locked overnight. He said fuel cards were being declined at gas stations across the state, and 2 massive vendor checks had just bounced. I was screaming that the bank had sent an automated notice regarding a comprehensive risk audit and a complete freeze on all operating capital. Julian dropped the milk carton on the counter, staring at the phone in sheer disbelief. He picked up the device, taking it off speakerphone, and began pacing the kitchen floor. He tried to calm his older brother down, telling him it must be a massive system error. I sat at the kitchen counter, taking a slow and peaceful sip of my tea. I watched Julian run his hand nervously through his hair, completely ignorant of the fact that his own financial embezzlement had triggered the cross-contamination audit, destroying his brother's company. He ended the call looking pale and deeply stressed. I set my tablet down and asked him what was wrong, keeping my voice laced with perfect wifely concern. He told me Andre was having a massive banking crisis and that the logistics company was suddenly being audited. I let a look of deep, sympathetic worry wash over my face. I told Julian that commercial audits happen sometimes, and that as long as Claire had kept their corporate books perfectly clean, they had absolutely nothing to worry about. I knew for an absolute fact that their books were not clean. I knew Claire frequently ran her luxury personal expenses through the corporate accounts to avoid taxes. The federal compliance audit was going to tear their entire financial structure to pieces and expose every single fraudulent transaction they had ever made. Julian nodded heavily, running a hand over his tired face, and told me he hoped I was right. He had no idea he was standing in the kitchen with the architect of their destruction. By Wednesday afternoon, the sheer gravity of the situation had fully crushed their arrogance. I was sitting in my corner office reviewing a market trend report when my private direct line began to ring. I saw Claire's number flashing on the caller identification screen. The sweet, condescending tone she loved to use was completely gone. When I answered the phone, her voice was shrill, frantic, and entirely desperate. She did not even bother with polite greetings. She immediately started begging me to talk to the underwriting department at my firm. She was crying, telling me that they could not pay their truck drivers, and that their major shipping contracts were threatening to cancel by the end of the week if the accounts were not unfrozen. I leaned back in my chair, my posture perfectly relaxed. I kept my voice incredibly calm, professional, and totally devoid of emotion. I told Claire that the compliance department operates independently and that federal banking regulations strictly prohibit me from interfering with an active risk audit. I listened to her hyperventilate through the receiver as the reality of her impending bankruptcy crashed down upon her. She pleaded with me, reminding me that we were family and that I had to do something to save their home and their business. I allowed a brief silence to stretch over the line, letting her wallow in her absolute helplessness. Then I offered her the exact same toxic advice she had so graciously given me at her dinner party. I told her in a smooth and chillingly sweet tone that she just needed to be patient. I told her that demanding men go through very stressful periods when they are trying to save their empires. I reminded her that as a soft and supportive wife, she needed to make sure Andre was getting taken care of properly at home, so he would not have to find his joy elsewhere during this terrible crisis. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. She gasped a short, strangled sound as the specific wording of my sentence registered in her panicked brain. She realized in that exact moment that I knew everything. I did not give her a chance to speak or formulate a lie. I gently placed the receiver back onto the phone base, ending the call and severing their final lifeline. I had completely neutralized two of my greatest enemies without ever raising my voice or stepping out of my office. They were trapped inside a financial burning building with no operating capital, no credit, and a looming federal investigation. I was the one holding the only key to the exit, and I had just thrown it into the ocean. I turned my chair to look out over the sweeping views of the city skyline. Claire and Andre were finished. Their marriage would inevitably implode under the massive stress of bankruptcy and federal auditing. They would lose the luxury farmhouse, the expensive cars, and the pristine social image they wielded like a weapon. They were out of the game. Now my crosshairs shifted entirely back to my husband. Julian was officially isolated. The brother he relied on for social cover and financial bragging rights was currently drowning in his own disaster. The sister-in-law who had facilitated his affair and offered her vacation home was currently watching her life collapse. Julian's support system had been completely eradicated, and he was next. The stage was perfectly set for the final act, and he was about to walk blindly into an ambush from which he would never, ever recover. He came home that evening, looking more stressed and agitated than I had ever seen him, but his trademark arrogance remained perfectly intact. He poured himself a tall glass of water and leaned heavily against the kitchen counter, putting on his best charismatic smile to mask his internal panic. He told me his parents' 40th wedding anniversary was coming up next weekend. He said he wanted to do something truly massive and unforgettable to celebrate their milestone. He talked enthusiastically about booking the Grand Oak Country Club, which was widely known as the most exclusive and outrageously expensive venue in the entire city. He spun a beautiful, compelling story about family legacy, honoring his parents' sacrifices, and projecting an image of undeniable success to their extended social circle. He told me that since his startup company was temporarily dealing with some frustrating banking holds and verification delays, he needed me to cover the venue deposit and the catering costs. He said it would mean the absolute world to him and his family if I could just bridge this minor financial gap for a few days. He promised he would pay me back with interest the second his massive investor funds cleared the bank. I looked at him, marveling silently at the sheer audacity of his request. His brother was facing imminent financial ruin. His mistress was waiting for him at a luxury hotel, and he was standing in my kitchen, asking his wife to fund a massive vanity project purely to stroke his own fragile ego. I did not hesitate for a single second. I smiled warmly and told him I would be absolutely honored to pay for his parents' anniversary party. I told him family is the most important thing in the world, and we should spare absolutely no expense to make sure they felt properly celebrated. I watched the profound relief wash over his face. He walked across the kitchen and kissed my forehead, calling me the greatest, most supportive wife a man could ever ask for. He really believed he had won. He firmly believed the money tap was still flowing freely and that I was completely blind to his deception. The very next morning, I drove to a local branch of my bank. I did not use our usual joint accounts or draw from my newly established blind trust. I opened a completely separate localized credit account specifically for this event. I requested a physical credit card, issued entirely in Julian S. name, as an authorized user. I worked directly with the bank manager to set a strict, unyielding credit limit on the card. I explicitly declined every single option for overdraft protection. I made it abundantly clear that if the balance exceeded the limit by even one single penny, the card must immediately decline. There was no grace period, no courtesy buffer, and absolutely no backup funding source attached to it. I brought the shiny new credit card home in a sleek velvet presentation box. I handed it to him that evening, telling him I wanted him to feel completely in control of the party planning process. I told him I specifically requested a card with his name printed on it so he could proudly present it to the country club vendors himself. I told him he deserved to be the man of the hour. Julian took the velvet box with a greedy, excited gleam in his eye. I was practically vibrating with self-importance. He immediately began calling the country club event coordinators, booking the most expensive catering packages, reserving the premium top-shelf open bar, and securing their coveted grand ballroom. He swiped that card for the initial deposits, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine hanging directly over his neck. The trap was perfectly laid. The country club required the final and largest payment to be processed on the actual day of the event, right before the dinner service officially began. Julian assumed the card I gave him had an unlimited ceiling because he was used to spending my wealth without consequence. He had no idea. The initial deposits had eaten up 99% of the available credit limit. The final swipe on the night of the party was mathematically guaranteed to fail spectacularly. The days leading up to the anniversary party passed in a blur of meticulous preparation. I finalized my presentation compiling all the evidence Desmond, the private investigator, had gathered over the past few weeks. I organized the financial documents, the wire transfer logs, and the high-definition photographs of Julian and Vanessa. I printed the horrific text messages from Claire's group chat, making sure every cruel word was highlighted. I arranged everything into a cohesive chronological narrative of their absolute betrayal. I was building a prosecution file that no defense attorney could ever dismantle. When Saturday morning finally arrived, the atmosphere in our house was crackling with heavy, unspoken tension. Julian was moving around the master bedroom with a frantic, arrogant energy. He wore a brand new tailored suit he had purchased specifically for the event, using the last remaining funds on his personal emergency card. He checked his reflection in the tall mirror, adjusting his silk pocket square and spraying on his expensive designer cologne. He turned to me and put on a flawless expression of deep regret. He told me he had a sudden last-minute investor meeting that he simply could not reschedule. He said a major venture capitalist was flying through the city and wanted a quick breakfast meeting to finalize a massive funding round for his startup. He promised he would head straight to the country club right after the meeting to ensure the caterers were setting everything up properly. He kissed my cheek and told me he would see me at the venue. I smiled, adjusting his lapel, and told him to go secure his future. I watched from the bedroom window as he drove away in his luxury car. I knew exactly where he was going. Desmond had already sent me a secure text message confirming that Vanessa had booked a room at a boutique hotel downtown. Julian was not meeting an investor. He was spending the morning in bed with his mistress, before hosting a lavish party funded entirely by his wife. I turned away from the window and began to get ready for the day. I chose a stunning crimson dress that commanded attention and projected absolute power. I styled my hair and applied my makeup with the precise, focused intensity of a warrior preparing for a final battle. Just as I finished fastening my diamond earrings, the doorbell rang, echoing through the quiet house. I walked downstairs and opened the heavy wooden front door. My dad, Thomas, stood on the front porch. He was wearing a sharp, dark charcoal suit, looking every bit the formidable patriarch he was. His posture was rigid, his broad shoulders squared, and his eyes carried a deep, protective fire. He stepped into the foyer and pulled a thick, heavy manila folder from his leather briefcase. The folder contained the final printed copies of every single piece of evidence, the finalized divorce papers, and the formal notifications ready to be sent to the federal compliance boards. My dad looked at me, his expression a mixture of profound pride and cold determination. He handed the heavy folder to me, its weight feeling like a weapon in my hands. "Safety is off, Maya," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "Take the shot." I looked at the heavy manila folder in my hands and felt a profound sense of closure wash over my spirit. The long, agonizing weeks of pretending, of smiling through the deceit, of sharing a home with a man who was actively trying to destroy my future were finally over. I had gathered all the data I had run, all the projections, and I had built a watertight case that would permanently sever his access to my life. I looked back up at my dad and gave him a sharp, confident nod. I was fully prepared to execute the final phase of the plan. I locked the front door behind us and walked down the driveway toward my car. The sky above the city was a brilliant, piercing blue, offering the perfect backdrop for the absolute destruction I was about to unleash on my husband and his complicit family. The drive to the Grand Oak Country Club felt like a slow procession toward an inevitable execution. The sky above the city had deepened into a rich twilight blue as my dad navigated his dark sedan through the winding, immaculate streets of the most exclusive neighborhood in the state. I sat in the passenger seat, perfectly still, the heavy manila folder resting on my lap like a loaded weapon. The country club was a fortress of old money and generational wealth, surrounded by acres of perfectly manicured golf courses and towering oak trees. Julian had chosen this specific venue because it represented everything he desperately wanted to be. He wanted the prestige, the status, and the undeniable validation of hosting a massive party in a ballroom that required a six-figure membership just to walk through the front doors. I had no idea that I had secured the venue using a restricted credit line that was currently holding on by a single thread entirely in his name. We pulled up to the grand entrance and the valet rushed forward to open my door. I stepped out of the car wearing my crimson dress and adjusting my posture until my spine was completely straight. My dad handed the keys to the valet and offered me his arm. We walked up the wide stone steps and through the towering brass double doors. The atmosphere inside the country club was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the low hum of classical music playing from a live string quartet in the corner of the grand foyer. Julian had spared absolutely no expense. He had ordered towering centerpieces of white orchids and imported roses. He had requested the premium top-shelf open bar and the highest-tier catering package available. I looked around at the sheer opulence of the event and felt a deep, satisfying calm. I was throwing a party to celebrate his parents, but he was actually building the perfect extravagant stage for his own absolute destruction. We walked into the main banquet hall. The room was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over 30 circular tables draped in heavy white silk. The room was already packed with Julian's extended family, his childhood friends, and numerous business associates he was trying to impress. I saw his parents sitting at the head table looking overwhelmed and deeply touched by the lavish celebration. His father was a retired high school teacher, and his mother had worked as a nurse for 40 years. They were good, honest, hardworking people who had sacrificed everything to give Julian and Andre a solid foundation. They had welcomed me into their family with open arms and genuine love. It broke my heart to know that the evening was going to end in tears, but they needed to know exactly who their sons had become. They needed to see the ugly truth hiding behind Julian's charming smile and Andre's boastful arrogance. I walked over to their table and greeted them warmly, hugging his mother and asking how she was enjoying the evening. She held my hands and told me with tears in her eyes how incredibly grateful she was for everything I had done. She said Julian had told them I handled all the financial arrangements for the party because I wanted to show my deep appreciation for the family. The sheer manipulative cruelty of his lie made my blood run cold, but I maintained my warm smile. I told her that family is the most important investment a person can make, and that tonight was going to be an unforgettable evening for everyone. As I stepped away from the head table, I spotted Andre and Claire walking through the crowd. The contrast in their appearance was immediate and glaring. They were trying desperately to project their usual smug superiority, but the cracks in their facade were painfully obvious. The federal compliance audit I had triggered on Andre's logistics company was clearly taking a massive toll. Andre looked haggard, his face pale and tight with stress. I was sweating slightly, adjusting his collar and constantly checking his phone. Claire looked even worse. Her signature performative enthusiasm was completely gone, replaced by a brittle, frantic energy. Her smile was tight and her eyes darted around the room with the panicked intensity of a trapped animal. They were drowning in the reality of frozen operating capital and imminent bankruptcy, but they were still trying to play the part of the wealthy, successful couple. Claire noticed me walking toward my designated table, and she immediately stiffened. She forced a smile and offered a brief, stiff greeting, complimenting my dress with a voice that lacked any of its usual southern sweetness. She asked me where Julian was, mentioning that it was strange for the host to be late to his own parents' anniversary party. I looked at her, noting the dark circles under her eyes that her expensive concealer could not quite hide. I told her Julian had a very important last-minute investor meeting that he simply could not reschedule. I said he was out securing his future, but that he would be arriving very soon. I watched Claire swallow hard, her eyes darting away from mine. She knew exactly where he was, and she knew I was completely oblivious. Or so she thought. She offered a weak excuse about needing to check on the catering staff and practically fled across the room, pulling Andre behind her. They were terrified of the audit, but they still believed their family secrets were perfectly safe. The dinner service began with a flawless presentation of upscale appetizers and expensive wine. The atmosphere in the room was joyful and celebratory, completely ignorant of the execution taking place in the shadows. I sat next to my dad at a table near the front of the room, quietly observing the guests and waiting for the guest of honor to arrive. Almost 45 minutes into the dinner service, the heavy oak doors at the back of the banquet hall swung open. Julian walked into the room. He was wearing his brand new tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled, and his charismatic smile securely in place. He moved through the crowd with effortless charm, shaking hands, patting shoulders, and apologizing profusely for his late arrival. He played the role of the dedicated, brilliant entrepreneur working tirelessly on a Saturday to build his empire. He finally made his way to our table and leaned down to kiss my cheek. The moment he got close, the faint, unmistakable scent of Vanessa's floral perfume hit my senses. It was mixed with the smell of his expensive cologne, a desperate attempt to mask the evidence of his morning spent in a boutique hotel room. It took every ounce of professional discipline I possessed not to recoil in absolute disgust. I took his seat next to me, sighing heavily and whispering about how grueling the investor meeting had been. He said the venture capitalists were tough, but he had finally secured the commitment they needed to scale the business. He reached under the table and squeezed my hand, telling me that all our sacrifices were finally going to pay off. I looked at him, feeling the heavy manila folder resting against my leg under the tablecloth. I squeezed his hand back and told him I knew exactly how big the payoff was going to be. The dinner service concluded, and the waitstaff began moving silently through the banquet hall, clearing the heavy porcelain plates to prepare the room for the formal toasts. The event coordinator, a young woman wearing a headset, approached the microphone at the front of the room. She tapped the microphone gently to get the attention of the massive crowd. She welcomed everyone to the Grand Oak Country Club and introduced Julian, calling him a loving son and a visionary entrepreneur. The room erupted in warm, enthusiastic applause as Julian stood up from his seat. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket and walked confidently toward the stage, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. I took the microphone from the coordinator, looking out over the sea of faces with an expression of profound humility and grace. He was completely in his element, commanding the room and soaking up the admiration of his family, and his wealthy peers. He began his speech by talking about his parents. He spoke eloquently about their years of hard work, their sacrifices, and the beautiful example of loyalty and commitment they had set for him and his older brother Andre. Hai told fabricated stories about growing up, about the values of honesty and integrity they had supposedly instilled in him from a young age. The sheer hypocrisy of his words was so thick it was almost suffocating to listen to. He then turned his attention to me, gesturing toward my table with a loving, sweeping motion of his hand. He told the entire banquet hall that behind every successful man is a brilliant and supportive woman. He praised my dedication, my patience, and my unwavering belief in his entrepreneurial dreams. He called me his beautiful, supportive rock and raised his crystal glass in my direction. I looked across the room and saw Claire sitting at her table. She was holding her wine glass, looking directly at me, with a sickening, smug smirk on her face. She was taking immense malicious pleasure in the irony of the situation. She was reveling in the fact that Julian was publicly praising me while actively stealing my money and sleeping with a younger woman in a vacation house she had provided for them. She thought the entire speech was an elaborate, hilarious inside joke that only the three of them understood. She had absolutely no idea that I was the one writing the final punchline to her pathetic joke. Julian finished his grand toast and the room broke into loud, enthusiastic applause. His parents were wiping tears from their eyes, completely moved by their golden son's beautiful tribute. Julian smiled, bowing his head modestly, and moved to hand the microphone back to the event coordinator. I stood up from my chair, smoothing the skirt of my crimson dress. I walked toward the stage, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. The room quieted down, assuming I was simply going to give a complimentary speech as the devoted, loving wife. I walked up the short, carpeted steps and took the microphone directly from Julian's hand. He smiled at me, a look of genuine affection, perfectly masking his rotten, deceitful core. I turned to face the crowd, feeling the heavy, expectant silence settle over the massive ballroom. I looked at Julian's parents, at Andre and Claire, and finally at my dad, who was sitting perfectly still, his eyes locked on me with fierce, absolute support. I thanked Julian for his beautiful words. I told the crowd that Julian was right about the immense importance of family loyalty and absolute honesty. I said that I had been reflecting deeply on the true foundation of our marriage and the incredible hard work Julian had been doing behind the scenes over the past few months. I told them I actually put together a small presentation to truly honor the depth of Julian's recent efforts and to show everyone exactly what kind of man he had become. Julian looked surprised, but pleased, assuming I had created a touching slideshow of his childhood photos or his startup journey. I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and pulled out a small black remote control. I pointed it at the audiovisual booth at the back of the room and pressed the main button. The massive motorized projector screens dropped down heavily from the ceiling right behind the head table. The crystal chandeliers dimmed automatically, plunging the room into a dramatic cinematic darkness. I pressed the button again, advancing to the very first slide. The massive screens illuminated with brilliant high-definition clarity. It was not a baby photo. It was the photograph my mom had taken at the airport baggage carousel. The image was perfectly clear, 50 feet wide, and completely undeniable. It showed Julian holding Vanessa, tightly wrapping his arms securely around her waist and pressing an intimate kiss to her temple. The timestamp and the specific location data were printed clearly in the bottom corner of the slide, showing it was taken the exact same day he was supposedly in Chicago. The entire banquet hall gasped in absolute unison. It was a sharp collective intake of breath that seemed to pull all the oxygen out of the room. Julian stared at the 50-foot image of himself holding Vanessa, and the blood drained from his face. His fingers loosened around the champagne flute in his hand. The glass slipped straight through them, struck the hardwood beside the head table, and shattered with a crack that echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. For one frozen second, he did not move. He simply stared at the timestamp, proving that while he claimed to be pitching investors in Chicago, he had been standing at our own airport kissing another woman. I did not give him a chance to speak or formulate a lie. I pressed the button and advanced to the second slide. The screen shifted, displaying the meticulously highlighted financial documents I had gathered. I had blown up the bank statements, the wire transfer logs, and the corporate registration of the offshore limited liability company. The numbers were massive, glaring, and highlighted in bright red. I spoke into the microphone, my voice ringing out clear, cold, and perfectly steady. I explained to the silent, horrified room that the man who just gave a speech about honesty and family values had been actively embezzling our joint life savings. I broke down the numbers for the crowd, detailing exactly how he was systematically draining my hard-earned assets to fund a hidden offshore account registered under his mistress's maiden name. I pointed to the dates on the screen showing how he had used the money I earned working grueling 60-hour weeks to pay for luxury hotel suites and expensive jewelry while claiming he was building a technology empire. The murmurs in the crowd rose into a low wave of shock and anger. Julian's mother covered her mouth with trembling hands, while his father stared at the numbers on the screen, his face turning red. Julian finally snapped out of his paralysis. He spun toward the audiovisual station and lunged for the projector cables, shouting that the images were fake and that I was humiliating him with doctored evidence. His hands were already reaching toward the equipment when my dad moved. Thomas stepped directly into his path before Julian could get within a few feet of the controls. My dad planted himself between Julian and the projector like a wall. He did not shove him and he did not raise his voice. He simply held his ground with the kind of controlled force that made Julian stop. Julian tried to angle him, but Thomas shifted with him and blocked the path again. I kept the remote in my hand and stayed beside the podium. Julian looked from my father to the screen and finally understood that he was not going to erase the evidence, unplug the presentation, or bully me into silence. The room had already seen too much, and I still had one final slide left to show them. I stepped around the podium, keeping my eyes locked on the crowd. I pressed the button for the third and final slide. The screen changed again, this time displaying the high-quality photographs of Claire's group chat. The Chi Town crew messages were blown up for everyone to read. The text was large, bright, and impossible to misinterpret. I read the messages out loud over the microphone, making sure every single person in the room heard the vile words. I read Vanessa complaining about Julian's boring wife. I read Julian talking about playing the game until the offshore account was fully funded. And then I read Claire's messages. I read her calling me a walking automated teller machine. I read her offering her and Andre's private vacation house on the lake for their secret romantic getaways. And worst of all, I read the messages where Claire called Julian's parents gullible old fools who would believe anything their golden boy told them. The reaction was catastrophic and immediate. Claire jumped out of her chair, her face pale and contorted with sheer panic. She started screaming from her table, her voice shrill and hysterical. She shouted that I was a bitter, aggressive woman, that I was violating her privacy, and that the messages were taken completely out of context. She tried to grab Andre's arm, but Andre was staring at the massive screen, reading the words his wife had typed about his own parents. Julian's mother broke down into loud, racking sobs, completely shattered by the profound betrayal of both her son and her daughter-in-law. His father stood up, pointing a shaking finger at Claire, telling her to keep her mouth shut. The entire family dynamic imploded right there in the middle of the grand ballroom. I stood on the stage, watching the absolute chaos unfold, with a deep, profound sense of peace. The illusion was dead. The truth was violently alive. I looked directly at Claire and Andre and raised the microphone one last time. By the way, Andre, I said that compliance audit that froze your operating capital this week was not a random system error. Your business line of credit was recalled this morning after I formally disclosed the conflict of interest and the suspicious fund transfers connected to Julian's offshore accounts. The compliance exposure contaminated your company's risk profile, and the freeze will remain in place while the review continues. I did not invent the problem. I stopped using my professional reputation to shield you from it. Andre's legs literally gave out beneath him. He collapsed backward into his chair, clutching his chest as the reality of his total financial ruin crashed down on him. Claire stopped screaming and covered her face with her hands, realizing that she had just lost everything she valued in life. I turned my attention back to Julian, who was standing behind my dad, shaking and weeping like a broken child. I walked over to the edge of the stage and picked up the heavy manila folder my dad had given me earlier. I dropped it directly onto the shattered remains of Julian's champagne glass on the head table. "Those are the finalized divorce papers," I said, staring directly at Julian. And because you tried to hide and divert joint assets through an account controlled by your mistress, my firm's compliance board notified the Securities and Exchange Commission yesterday. You are not just getting divorced, Julian. You are facing a federal fraud investigation. Good luck with the audit. For several seconds, Julian could not seem to process what I had said. His eyes moved from the divorce papers to the financial slides still glowing behind me, and then to his parents. The arrogance that had carried him through every lie was gone. He looked smaller somehow, as if the room had finally stripped away the version of himself he had been performing for years. "Maya, wait," he said. His voice was no longer loud. It cracked around my name. "We can work this out." That sentence caused a different kind of silence. Even the relatives who had been whispering stopped. Julian took one step toward me, and Thomas immediately lifted one hand, not touching him, just making it clear that he would not get closer unless I allowed it. Julian held both palms out. "Please. I know how this looks, but you do not have to do this here. We can go home. We can talk. I can explain everything." I looked at the giant photograph behind him. "Explain the airport," I asked. "Explain the hotel. Explain the account in Vanessa's name. Explain the messages where you told her you only had to keep playing the game until the offshore account was fully funded." His mouth opened, but no answer came. Then he tried a different strategy. "I made mistakes," he said quickly. "I got in too deep. The startup was under pressure. I was scared. Vanessa was helping with contacts and things crossed a line. But I can fix the money. I can put it back." "You did not borrow money," I said. "You hid it. Month after month. You labeled transfers so they would look like business expenses. You lied about where you were going. You let me work 60-hour weeks while you planned a financial exit with another woman. That was not panic. That was a plan." His mother stood abruptly from the head table. Her chair scraped hard against the floor. She was crying, but the grief in her face had hardened into anger. She looked at Julian first. "You stood here 10 minutes ago and talked about loyalty," she said. "You used your father and me as props in a speech about honesty while you knew this was waiting behind the curtain." Julian turned toward her. "Mom, please. Do not call me that like I am supposed to rescue you from this," she snapped. Claire tried to speak over her. "This is being twisted. Maya is angry, and she is making everything look worse than it was." Julian's mother swung toward Claire. "Worse than it was, I just read your words with my own eyes. You called us gullible old fools." Claire went pale again. "That was a joke. It was private. I was frustrated." "A joke," Julian's father said. His voice was quieter than his wife's, which made it cut through the room even more sharply. "You helped our son deceive his wife, and you laughed about us while you did it." Andre pushed his chair back and stared at Claire as if he no longer recognized her. "You told me the lake house weekends were for your friends," he said. "You told me you were helping Julian with investor introductions. You brought this into our house and our business without telling me what you were doing." Claire immediately pointed at Julian. "He asked me to cover for him. He said Maya never paid attention to him. He said the marriage was basically over." Julian spun on her. "Do not put this all on me. You introduced me to Vanessa." The accusation hit the room like another explosion. Claire shouted back that she had only made an introduction and that Julian had been the one sending messages, booking rooms, and moving money. Andre demanded to know how long she had been lying to him. Julian's mother demanded to know how many family dinners had been staged, while everyone smiled in Maya's face. Their voices collided until the perfect family image Julian had spent years protecting dissolved into open blame. I did not have to interrupt them. That was the point. I had spent weeks collecting facts because facts do not need help once they are visible. Julian turned back to me, desperate now. "I will sell the car," he said. "I will sell the watch. I will shut the company down if that is what you want. I will give every dollar back. Just do not leave like this." I glanced at the Rolex on his wrist. The same watch I had seen at the airport. The same symbol he once told me represented the empire we were building together. "You keep talking as if the problem is the price of things," I said. "It is not. The watch did not betray me. The car did not betray me. The startup did not wake up every morning and decide to lie to my face. You did." He swallowed hard. "Maya, please. 5 years has to mean something." "It does," I said. It means I gave you 5 years of trust. It means I know this was not one bad night. It means I know exactly how much time you had to stop and exactly how many times you chose not to. He reached toward the manila folder, as if he could somehow push the papers back at me and reverse the moment. Thomas stepped closer, and Julian let his hand fall. My mother came to stand on my other side. Valerie did not say anything at first. She simply looked at Julian with the same calm expression she had worn at the airport. Then she said, "You had a woman who believed in you enough to finance your dream. You mistook support for weakness. That was your mistake." Julian's father lowered himself slowly back into his chair. He looked exhausted. I had never seen disappointment settle so visibly across someone's face. He told Julian that whatever happened next, he would not ask me to protect him from the consequences. Julian stared at him, as if that refusal hurt more than the shouting. Claire began crying openly, but Andre moved his chair away from her. He asked her for her phone. She refused. He asked again louder, and she clutched her purse against her chest. The argument immediately shifted from Maya versus the family to the family confronting its own secrets. That was the moment I knew the confrontation was finished. There was nothing left for me to prove. Julian looked at me one last time. "Tell me what I have to do," he whispered. I shook my head. "That is the part you still do not understand. There is nothing you can do to make me participate in this marriage anymore. The legal process can handle the money. The investigators can handle the accounts. You are going to handle the consequences of your own choices." His shoulders sagged. Behind him, the 3 slides remained on the screens like a balance sheet. No one in the room could argue with the affair, the money and the people who helped him hide both. I lowered the microphone. I had imagined this moment dozens of times during the previous weeks. In some versions I shouted. In some I listed every insult and every dollar. But standing there now, I did not need any of that. The truth had already done the loudest work. I turned the microphone off and dropped it onto the podium. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. I walked down the stage steps, linking my arms smoothly with my mom and my dad. We did not look back as we walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, leaving the screaming, crying, and absolute devastation behind us. As we reached the heavy brass doors of the country club, the venue manager approached Julian, looking incredibly panicked. He held a leather binder in his shaking hands. "Sir," he stammered loudly enough for the silent lobby to hear. "The credit card you provided for the $15,000 catering and venue balance has completely declined. We need an alternative form of payment immediately, or we will have to call the authorities." Julian looked up at me from across the room, sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes. He realized the trap I had set. He realized he was standing in the most expensive country club in the state, entirely responsible for a massive bill, with absolutely zero access to my wealth. I smiled, offering him a small, polite wave. "That is his problem," I told the manager clearly. "My name is not on the contract." We walked out through the revolving doors and into the cool evening air. For the first time since the airport, I was no longer acting. I did not have to keep my face neutral, pretend to believe a story about Chicago, or calculate what Julian might notice in the joint accounts. My father unlocked the car while my mother squeezed my hand. Behind us, through the country club doors, the argument was still going. I could hear Julian's voice rise once and then disappear beneath the rest of the family. I did not turn around. The first 48 hours were chaos for everyone except me. Julian called until I blocked his personal number. He sent messages from his business phone, then from email, then through family members who had not yet understood the full situation. I did not argue with him. Harrison had already given me one rule from that point forward: anything involving money, property, or the divorce would go through counsel. I followed it. Every message Julian sent became another record, not another invitation into the same emotional cycle. By Monday morning, the consequences had moved beyond the country club. The images and the confrontation had spread through the network Julian depended on for credibility. More importantly, the financial records were now sitting with people whose job was to evaluate risk without caring about his charm. Investors who had been willing to listen to his next pitch suddenly wanted documentation. Commitments he had spoken about as if they were guaranteed stalled. Meetings disappeared from his calendar. The startup had survived for years because I kept filling the gaps while Julian sold confidence. Once my money was protected and the fraud investigation became real, there was no cushion left beneath the performance. Within weeks, the company began collapsing under its own numbers. Julian tried to describe the problem as temporary bad publicity, but publicity was not the real issue. The real issue was that he could no longer explain the transfers connected to Vanessa without exposing the way he had been using our shared assets. Vendors demanded payment. Potential investors stepped away. The story he had told everyone about being one breakthrough away from success finally collided with the books. The divorce process was less dramatic than the party and far more final. Harrison handled the filings. I provided statements, transfer histories, copies of the corporate registrations, and the photographs I had collected. I did not need to invent a narrative. The dates told it for me. The same weeks Julian claimed he was traveling for investors were the weeks hotel charges appeared. The same months he asked me to increase my support for his company were the months money moved toward the account controlled by Vanessa. Every piece fit into the next one. Julian tried bargaining through his attorney. First, he wanted time. Then he wanted access to more cash so he could keep the startup alive. Then he argued that saving the company would eventually benefit both of us. That was the old pattern. In a new envelope, he wanted me to absorb his risk one more time. The answer remained no. I would meet my lawful obligations, but I would not voluntarily finance the machine he had used to betray me. Andre and Claire were unraveling on a separate track. The compliance audit on the logistics company did not disappear because the anniversary party ended. With operating capital frozen during review, every weakness in their business model became urgent. Trucks still needed fuel, drivers still expected payroll, vendors still expected payment. The line of credit I had once helped secure could no longer function as the invisible bridge carrying them over every cash shortage. Andre spent his days trying to stabilize the company while also learning how much Claire had hidden from him. Their marriage became another casualty of the group chat. Andre could not get past the fact that Claire had used their lake house to facilitate Julian's affair and had lied about it for months. Claire could not get past the fact that Andre blamed her for a financial collapse she insisted was bigger than the affair. They fought about the business, the house, the messages, and the humiliation at the country club. The performance of the perfect wealthy couple did not survive contact with the truth. Julian's parents withdrew from the spectacle almost completely. His mother called me once. She did not ask me to forgive him, and she did not tell me marriage required sacrifice. She apologized for the fact that I had been betrayed while sitting at their family table, and said she was ashamed that Claire had treated my work and my race as material for private jokes. His father spoke only briefly. He said he had spent his life trying to teach his sons that a name meant nothing without character. Then he told me I owed them no explanation for protecting myself. That call mattered to me more than I expected. I had never wanted to destroy Julian's parents. They had not been part of the Cheetown crew. The anniversary party hurt them because Julian and Claire had used the family itself as camouflage. Knowing that his parents could finally separate my actions from the lies surrounding them removed one more weight I had been carrying. Vanessa disappeared from the center of the story almost as quickly as she had entered it. Once the money stopped moving, and Julian's legal problems became impossible to ignore, the glamorous secret life lost its shine. I did not contact her. I did not need a confrontation. The account bearing her name was already part of the financial record. Whatever promises Julian had made her were now his problem, just as the country club bill had been his problem. By the second month, Julian was no longer living in our house. The startup had effectively collapsed as investors pulled away amid the investigation, and his legal fees consumed what remained of his accessible funds. The expensive car was gone. The designer suits stopped appearing in photographs. The man who once talked about becoming a technology titan was living out of a cheap motel while meeting lawyers and trying to explain transfers he had assumed I would never discover. I did not celebrate the motel. I did not need to. The satisfaction came from something quieter. None of his emergencies were mine anymore. When his company could not make a payment, my phone did not ring asking me to move money. When his attorney wanted a document, Harrison handled it. When Claire and Andre argued about their house, I was not pulled into the middle as the family member expected to solve the financial problem. For the first time in 5 years, my income was building my future instead of subsidizing someone else's fantasy. I moved carefully during those months. I found a downtown condo with enough space for the life I actually lived, rather than the image Julian had wanted us to project. I chose it myself. No oversized rooms purchased for parties I did not want. No expensive gadgets added because a struggling founder needed to feel successful. The balcony overlooked the city, and the office had a door I could close at the end of the day. Those details mattered because they were mine. At work, I became sharper, rather than distracted. I had worried that the personal scandal would damage the professional reputation I had spent years building, but the opposite happened. I had disclosed the conflict, documented the suspicious activity, and followed the compliance process instead of using my position to hide a family problem. Months after the airport, the firm promoted me to senior partner. When the announcement came, I sat alone in my office for a minute staring at the message. Julian had once treated my career as the endless source of money financing his dream. Now the same career was opening a door that belonged only to me. Claire and Andre eventually separated under the pressure of bankruptcy and mistrust. Their business never recovered its old position. Julian's relationship with his family fractured as well. Some relatives blamed Claire, some blamed Julian, and some simply stopped taking their calls. I stayed out of those arguments. I had spent enough time inside their version of family loyalty. I no longer needed a vote in how they distributed blame. The federal investigation did not resolve overnight, and I never pretended it did. Investigations move through documents, interviews, and time. What mattered to me was that the process was no longer hidden. Julian could not move money in the dark and rely on my trust to protect him. The records existed. The regulators had them. The divorce case had them. And I had already secured the only outcome I truly needed. He no longer controlled my financial future or my emotional life. Several months after the anniversary party, my parents came back from Atlanta for a weekend. This time I did not meet them at an airport holding a handmade welcome sign with a husband waiting somewhere inside a lie. I picked them up in my own car and drove them directly to the condo I had bought after the separation. That evening, the three of us sat on the balcony while the sun lowered between the buildings. The city lights began turning on one floor at a time beneath us. I poured wine for my mother and father and set the bottle on the small table between our chairs. For a while, none of us talked about Julian. We talked about my promotion, my mother's garden back in Atlanta, and a contracting project my father had finally decided not to take because he was learning how to enjoy saying no. Eventually, Thomas lifted his glass and looked at me. "Do you remember what I told you at the airport?" he asked. I smiled. "We do not make scenes. We make them pay." My mother shook her head at him. "You have been waiting months to hear yourself quoted." He laughed, but then his expression softened. "I was angry when I said it," he admitted. "I wanted that man to hurt because he hurt my daughter. But what you did was better than anything I had in mind. You did not destroy yourself trying to destroy him. You protected what was yours and let the truth collect the debt." I looked out over the skyline. That distinction had become important to me. At the beginning, I had imagined revenge as a series of dramatic victories: the declined card, the frozen accounts, the projector screen. Those moments had been satisfying, but they were not the part that changed my life. The real victory was waking up without checking whether Julian had lied to me before breakfast. It was seeing my paycheck arrive in an account built for my future. It was walking into work knowing my ambition was not a character flaw that needed to be softened for someone else's comfort. Valerie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You trusted him," she said. "That was not the mistake. The mistake would have been seeing the truth and continuing to finance the lie." I nodded. For years, Julian had framed my support as proof that I believed in him. Claire had framed the same support as evidence that I was foolish and neglectful. Both of them misunderstood the source of it. I had supported my marriage because commitment mattered to me. Once the marriage became a structure designed to exploit that commitment, I was allowed to stop investing. The final papers were moving toward completion. The investigations were still taking their course. Andre and Claire were dealing with the consequences of their own choices, and Julian was dealing with his. None of those outcomes required me to watch every day. I had stopped measuring my recovery by how badly they were doing. My promotion to senior partner had come with a new office and more responsibility. I was already planning the next stage of my career. For the first time in years, when I built a 5-year financial projection, every assumption belonged to me. There was no hidden column for Julian's startup, no emergency transfer for a pitch trip, no luxury purchase disguised as encouragement. My future finally balanced. The sun disappeared completely, and the windows across the skyline turned gold. My father raised his glass. My mother raised hers. I lifted mine with them. I thought about Terminal 4, the Rolex, the Platinum card, the Black Town car, the hotel, the group chat, and the country club ballroom. Every one of those moments had felt enormous when I was living through it. From this balcony, they looked like points on a chart showing the exact moment a bad position stopped being worth saving. I took a slow sip of wine and smiled. They thought they could play me for a fool, but they forgot one crucial thing: I build portfolios for a living. I know exactly how to bankrupt a bad investment.